A few years ago, the economist Thomas Piketty became a world celebrity with his book Capital in the 21st Century, a book which actually became the best-selling economics book of the 21st century so far. His new book, Capital and Ideology, is now available in English in the bookshops. Thomas Piketty is here to talk to the FT about the book. Welcome. The previous book really put inequality on the map. Here you talk about ideology and how it shapes what you call inequality regimes and how inequality in turn shapes ideology. Give us a glimpse of the argument.
Well, the novelty of this book as compared to the previous one is that in the previous one I was very much centered on the experience of Western countries, in particular Western Europe and North America during the 20th century, and the way World War I, World War II contributed to a big reduction of inequality. Here I take a much broader comparative and international perspective. I look at India, I look at Brazil, I look at South Africa, China, Latin America, and this allows me, I think, to better understand how over time, over a long period of time, you see major transformation of the structure of inequality in various countries, and the main driving force, I think, is not so much violent destruction through war or economic deterministic forces or technological or cultural forces, but rather the changing ideology and the changing political mobilization about inequality. So you see countries in history which used to be very unequal in their organization of property relation, like Sweden, which we now view as a very egalitarian country, but between 1865 and 1911, you had actually voting rights that belonged first only to the top 20% of the population, but within this top 20%, you could have between 1 or 100 voting rights, depending on the level of your property and tax, and in several dozen municipal elections, you could actually have one individual who had alone more than 50% of the vote, including the prime minister of the time. And if you had told someone in Sweden in 1910 that this was going to become a very egalitarian country, the whole political system was organized very differently. And there are many other national trajectories, examples of countries that I describe in the book, the change in the structure of inequality in India during the period of colonization, and how independent India, tried to develop positive discrimination in order to revert some of these very strong inequalities toward the formerly discriminated lower caste of society. So lots of examples showing that there's nothing natural in the way social and economic inequalities are organized in any given place. It really depends on the imagination of societies and also the ability of the different sort of narratives on inequality to win the day through mobilization, through political platform. And I think it will be the same in the future.
It's kind of an interesting evolution from your previous book, which I think left some readers with a bit of fatalism, in the sense that there was, some of the measures seem to be, there are some very strong material forces at work here that makes inequality, there's a strong tendency towards widening inequalities. And this perspective on ideas, and in some sense, I think, more optimistic in that if you change enough people's imagination, as you put it, things can change in the material economy very quickly. When you look at the global perspective, do you find that these changes in ideas have global reach? What happens in one place also happens somewhere else, or are these idiosyncratic to different countries?
Well, sometimes you have a very quick diffusion of ideas. So if you think of the rise of progressive taxation of income and wealth around World War I and in the interwar period, it's very striking to see this very fast diffusion of ideas. So until 1914, no country would dare having a top income tax rate or a top inheritance tax rate above 10 or 20%. And then suddenly in the interwar period, having 60, 70, 80% on very large income or very large wealth becomes almost the norms. Following, the US, which has been a leader in the development of progressive taxation in the interwar period, up until Reagan, basically, up until 1980. And
they introduced an income tax, 1915, something like that? It's
1913 in the US, so it was actually before the war. It's interesting that in the case of the US, it was, peaceful social mobilization that took more than 20 years because they had to change the federal constitution in order to make the possibility of a federal income tax constitutional. In France, you have to wait until World War I. It's really in the summer of 1914. Yeah, well, this is here in the case of France. This is very sad story. That it's only to pay for the war with Germany that finally the political decision is taken to create an income tax. Before that, the French political elite would say, okay, in France, we had the French Revolution. So that's enough. We are already a country of equals. So we are not like aristocratic Britain or authoritarian Prussia. And that's also an interesting example on how sometimes the elite, tend to instrumentalize their own national history in order to, prevent
this is one function
some
of
reform.
ideology, as you described.
Yeah, sometimes it's to protect your own interest, but I try to take this set of ideas seriously because they're always more than just pure hypocrisy. I mean, there is some hypocrisy sometimes, but it's usually they always have some grain of plausibility.
People drink their own Kool-Aid.
Yeah,
especially if they're paid for it.
We have to take these ideas. We always have to take them seriously if we want to go beyond them and move to a different inequality regime.
And it almost sounds from the book that if it's the ideas that change and that's what drives it, it actually sticks more because you mentioned that Germany didn't have very high tax rate for very long. It was basically under Western occupation. So, I mean, it seems like when the ideas change, you actually get more lasting change.
That's right. So in the case of Germany, there are other ideas that actually change and work quite well, which is the whole idea of co-management, where you have workers' rights in the board of companies. And so this was created in the 1950s, where, in large corporations in Germany, you have half of the seats in the board of large companies, which go to a worker representative elected by workers. The other half go to shareholders. So shareholders actually have half of the seat plus one, so they have the decisive vote. But if workers, in addition to their 50% of the vote as workers, own 10% of the shares or 20% of the share of the company, or if some local government, regional government, which sometimes happen in Germany, own 10 or 20% of the share, then you can have a change in the controlling majority of the company, in spite of the fact that some private shareholder has 80% of the share. So you can see this enormous legal transformation as compared to the one share, one vote view of private property in private corporation. And this is an example of an innovation that actually did not spread too much. Progressive taxation was an example where you have large international diffusion. Here, this sort of remained a specificity of Germany and Sweden and Nordic countries, but until the present day, this did not really spread, and in Britain, in US, or actually in France, in my own country, you still stick very much to the one share, one vote principle. I think this could change in the future because in the end, this German Nordic system of co-management, worked pretty well
quite successful.
in getting workers to be more involved in the long-term investment strategy of their firm. And I think this is something that is now discussed, including in the US by Warren and Sanders, of introducing more workers' rights in the board of US companies. And I think this could be, if this was adopted in the US, in Britain and France, there could be a world diffusion of this other model of corporate governance going on, and this would be a pretty major change.
So more broadly, what is the state of play in terms of ideology today? It does feel like everyone's sort of looking for a new direction.
Yeah, I think we live at a time of great uncertainty because the ideology of globalization and financial deregulation as it has developed in the 1980s is now at a time of crisis. So, and first of all, in the US and the UK, where, there was, Reagan sort of made the claims that we will get more growth, more innovation by relying on a more, free market. And
the government is the problem,
But, 30 years later, in fact, US workers have not really seen the growth. And if anything, the growth rate in the US has been divided by two following the Reagan decade. Between 1990 and 2020, so over this 30-year period, you only have 1.1% growth in per capita national income in the US, which is twice as less as between 1950 and 1990. So the claim that by reducing top income tax rate and actually divided them by two, you would stimulate more innovation and growth. This could have been true. This could have been true, but that's not what we've seen. And I think this is why today, basically, you have two possible reaction to that. You have either the sort of the Trump or, in a way, the Brexit discourse, which is to say, okay, we're going to limit the competition from foreign workers, so we're going to limit the flow of people, the flow of immigration. Build a wall with Mexico and protect yourself from foreign competition. And in the UK, you've had a little bit of that with Polish workers and stop the free circulation of people. Now there's another way, which is I think of trying to regulate the circulation of people, to regulate more the circulation of capital, or at least to try to. If you want to have free capital flow going on, I think you need to have in exchange a more equitable tax system for large corporations, for large wealth holders, income holders. So now in between, you could have business as usual. You don't want to regulate more labor, you don't want to regulate more capital, but I don't think this is really an option.
It doesn't seem sustainable. And you, of course, participate. You don't just analyze this, but you participate, and you're in that second camp arguing for more progressive taxation. You also talk about shared power in corporations. We've already mentioned that. But tell us about your wealth tax proposal, because in the book it comes out as pretty draconian. You have tax rates going up to 90%. In a proposal.
Yeah, actually, this has been done in the past, at least as exceptional wealth taxes, for instance, after World War II in Germany or Japan, in order to reduce very large public debt of the time. There was progressive tax up to 90% on very large wealth portfolio. And this worked pretty well, because this allowed these two countries, Germany and Japan, to reduce very fast their public debt and then to invest in public infrastructure, education in the 50s, 60s, and I think this was a large success. Now it depends, of course, the level of wealth at which you do that. If you tax 90% someone who owns the entire world, you would still own 10% of the world, which is a lot. So it's all we have to discuss. So to put concrete numbers, I use in the proposal I make, I use the proceeds of the annual wealth tax and of the tax on inheritance entirely to finance a system of inheritance for all, where everybody at age 25 will receive 120,000 euros. Now, in the system I propose, so people who now receive zero would receive 120,000. This is about half.
This is a one-off payment at age 25.
Age 25.
Like a one-off universal basic income.
Like inheritance.
Yep.
And so people who used to receive zero will receive 120,000. That's about half of the population who now receive close to zero. People who today will receive 1 million. After the tax, everything, they will receive 620,000. So, this is not complete equality. And if you want my opinion, I think we could go further than that. But I think what's important is that, poor children or, children of the middle class and the lower middle class also have, good ideas to, create firm or, and if they can also buy an apartment. And I think, property is also a way to change the power structure in society and to give more bargaining power to people so that they can, better choose which job and which wage to accept. And this is a way to allow more people to participate in the economy in a way where, you can make plans, I think this is really what we need. I think the level of inequality we have today is not only unfair, but it's also not efficient for the working of our economy, where we live in very educated societies and we need, broad participation by very large group. And the ideology that we still have today, that, more concentrated power and more concentrated ownership is always good, and no matter the number of zeros for the billionaire wealth, it's always we should always keep it like that. I think is not convincing.
So, what do you say to those who say, well, we regret that wealth is so concentrated, but your sort of proposal is so confiscatory that it completely removes the incentive for accumulation, and that will be bad for productivity and growth, and in the end will hurt even those you try to help. That is a standard counter-argument. And what's your answer?
Well, as I was saying, someone who was about to inherit 1 million would still inherit 620,000. So why is it that, some people should inherit, 10 times, 100 times more than others? All children have good ideas in life to make projects. And, I think we have to think harder about this. And, the view that because you've made a fortune, say at age 30, you should keep all the decision-making power at age 50, 70, 90, I think corresponds to a sort of monarchical view of the working of modern economy and modern corporations that is really at odds with reality. Today we have a lot more billionaires and much wealthier billionaires in the US and in the world than what we had in the 70s or 80s. But in terms of productivity growth, we actually don't. So we have billionaires everywhere except in growth statistics.
Right.
So people say we have more innovation because we have more patents. But yes, okay, maybe people put their patents and they put their name everywhere, including on stuff they did not invent themselves. But if this were real innovation, you should see it in productivity and in output growth and the growth of income and wages. And we've not seen that in the past 30 years. So
it's clear that we have seen higher taxes with higher productivity growth in the past. But one final question about this. I mean, in the past, you've advocated an international wealth tax. Could this be done by a single country? Because it's somewhat utopian to think that everyone has to do it at once. Is it possible to pursue your sort of program, very steep wealth taxation, for one country to start with?
Well, you have to rethink the way you organize the movement of capital and capital control. So this is what I was saying earlier about control of individual labor flow or control of capital. You have to do something, I think, about the capital flow. So take, for instance, the proposals that have been made in the US by Warren and Sanders to introduce a billionaire tax,
right,
up to 6%, 8% per year of tax payment to billionaires.
In the Sanders case.
And what they both add to this is the fact that if you want to go away with your wealth, well, first, as long as you are a US citizen, even if you go away, you pay the tax. Now, if you really want to go away and give up US citizenship and bring your wealth to Switzerland, what Warren and Sanders are saying is, okay, you can do that, but you will pay an exit tax of 40%.
Right.
So you leave home 40% of your wealth. Now, the US federal government has the capability to enforce that, which will not be the case of any government in the world. So clearly, there's an asymmetry in the state capacities. So that doesn't mean that smaller governments cannot do anything, but clearly they have to think harder about, maybe they cannot have a tax that is as progressive as in the US. But what this illustrates is that there are still things you can do,
right,
without waiting for, the UN adopting a wealth tax. Because
so even in an era of globalization, national power hasn't actually been exhausted.
No, you can do a lot. And if you think of, co-management that we referred to before, Germany and Sweden didn't wait for the UN to adopt co-management to apply it. And this has worked pretty well. So the view that, nation states cannot do anything anymore, I think is wrong. Now, sometimes they need to take tough, unilateral actions, in order to step aside a little bit of the legal framework of free capital flows that we've seen in the past. So when you have an exit tax of 40%, you're not exactly in the free capital flow world of before. Or, actually when Obama in 2010 threatens Switzerland that they will lose their banking license if they don't change their legislation about bank secrecy, we are not quite in the just free capital flow, you do what you want kind of setting that actually was almost constitutionalized in Europe. So that's the problem with Europe, is that if France and Germany were telling Luxembourg, we're going to take away your banking license if you don't transmit information of our taxpayer in Luxembourg, then in fact Luxembourg could sue France and Germany with the Court of Justice in Luxembourg, saying, well, look, in the Maastricht Treaty, it never says that we have to give you this information. It says that capital can flow with no counterpart of any kind. Yeah. So now what do we do? Do we wait for another Obama, to solve the problem of Europe with Switzerland and Luxembourg? Or do we, at some point, accept the idea that, okay, we made mistakes in the way we wrote the Maastricht Treaty and the treaties organizing globalization in general in the 80s, 90s, but we are not going to wait for Luxembourg to agree to change it. So at some point, you need some unilateral departure to propose a new treaty. But if if Luxembourg doesn't accept, you have to put sanctions, and in the end, this is politics. This cannot just be legal treaties. You made a mistake in the past, therefore we're going to stick with it for another 50 years. So that's the difficult part where we are today. But if you don't do this kind of departure from the current organization of globalization, then you end up with nativist parties,
right.
Who are going to propose another kind of departure, which is basically to be very tough with migrants, because that's easier than being tough with Google or with rich people. But in the end, this nativist departure is much more frightening, I think, for globalization, and in addition, is not going to solve the problem of rising inequality, is not going to solve the problem of global warming. So we have to choose between different, options, and business as usual I think, is not an option.
A provocative contribution to the raging battle of ideas. Thomas Piketty, thank you very much for talking to the FT.
Thank you.